And we're back. Better late than never. I figured I'd do a little rearranging. I bought a couple things. Really doubled down on this whole filming thing. Some of you complained about that porting bench of mine that had that deteriorated particle board. I happen to like it, but it moved with me 2 or 3 times. It may have lived outside. I figured it was time for an upgrade. So here we are. This is the same bench. I put it on wheels, put some plywood on it. This might be the place where we do some of our filming from now on. We'll do some teardowns. It'll look good. If I'd show a little commitment for once in my life, maybe I'd set up some metal benches. But as cheap as I am, I'd say that this is a big improvement. So today, I figured we'd talk about valve guides. This is an RHS small block forward head. I've got a handful of these sitting on the shelf. They happen to be a really nice head. Unfortunately, a lot of them had a pretty fatal flaw. We'll get kind of in depth here. We'll talk about different guide materials, what applications require what types of guides, why I would use one versus another. This specific set was taken apart because it had a unknown oil consumption issue that ended up being the valve guides. Valve train geometry was set up properly. Everything was as kosher as you could get as far as the small block forward is concerned, but big fatal flaw in these was they put in a phosphorus bronze guide. Often you'll see the terms manganese bronze and phosphorus bronze tossed around. Those are generic labels for different types of valve guides. There's different alloys. Some work really well, some don't. This one happened to be one of the bad alloys. Don't ask me to name them. That's a problem. Believe it or not, this thing ran pretty good. If you could ignore the giant cloud of smoke behind you. So, in this case, it was easier to put a different set of heads on and to revisit these heads after the fact. Phosphorus bronze tends to be pretty easy on parts, but when you get into levels of wear like this, I'm afraid it takes no prisoners. So here's one of the valves that I junked. This is an intake valve. I junked one of the exhaust valves as well. When I took these heads apart, everything was covered in gross oil. There was a big thick layer of oil in the back of the intake valves. The exhaust valves were pretty gross as well. I have another pair of these heads that had the exact same type of failure. I'll pull one of those out and show you what this looked like. Obviously this valve's pretty clean. I'll go over this in a separate video, but I run all my used valves through a tumbler. I'll usually leave them in overnight, unless it's some special case like a titanium valve or has a black nitride coating on it. If it's got a chrome stem, it's pretty safe to run inside the tumbler overnight, and it actually does a really good job of cleaning up some of these cheaper valves. So I've got gloves on. This intake came out of one of the counterparts of this head. Had the exact same failure. This happens to be titanium, but for demonstration purposes, isn't going to matter. The heads that these valves were in had the exact same type of failure. You see here, there's just all kinds of loose crap on the back of the valve. I'd say that's built up at least, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch. The back of this valve would be shaped pretty similarly to this. So let's see, let's get that side-by-side comparison. Oh yeah, that's pretty bad. Outside of the fact that you don't want raw oil inside of your combustion chamber, another thing that this does is as soon as it burns, it turns into this really hard, almost carbon-like substance. I'll show you on an exhaust valve here shortly. When that gets stuck between the valve faces, it leaves these little pits. It's a lot harder than the valves, and as far as titanium is concerned, this is titanium's worst enemy. It'll wear through a coating like nobody's business, and it'll just destroy the valve. So I'd say this happens to be a pretty extreme case, but let's see. I shouldn't be able to do that. It's pretty bad. I can't imagine what that was like when it was running. Could do the same thing on the chamber side as well. It's kind of burnt, but it's still pretty flaky. Waste of a $150 valve, I'd say. This is one of the exhaust valves that came out of that engine. If you notice this tan, almost white colored carbon buildup on the valve face. Same thing on the back side, that's all oil. If you see buildup like this, that's a sign that you've got an oil consumption issue. Everyone likes to think that oil is wet and black looking, but it just isn't. A lot of times it'll show itself as a white deposit or a tan deposit. This is a pretty classic look in regards to an oil consumption problem. This thing didn't run long enough for us to be able to see pits in the valve face, but often enough you'll see really deep pits worn into the valve face, and that's what happens when this stuff breaks off and gets caught between the valve face and the seat. Now everybody, get a good look at this. This is an extreme case of wear. You don't want to see this, especially when you've got $1,500 worth of titanium inside of your cylinder heads. But this is what you don't want to see. Let's get a good look at what you would like to see. This is basically the same valve. In fact, this is a used valve. Still titanium. It's got a stem coating. Valve face was reground. I think only thing that was done to this was it was sonic cleaned. If those heads were healthy, this is basically what those valves would look like when they came out. Unfortunately, since all that oil's built on so thick, I wouldn't be able to tumble it. I'd have to scrape all this stuff off, then put it in the tumbler, get it sonic cleaned, polish the valves, send them out to get coated, and these can go back into service. We'll have to regrind the face too. Now, in the case of the steel valves that I pulled out of that pair of heads I showed you, I ended up junking one intake and one exhaust. Now, why is that? Look at the valve stem. It goes silver, 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 then gray. So in this section from here to here, it's almost reddish looking. What else is reddish looking? A phosphor bronze guide. Because the guide had so much wear, it wore the chrome right off the valve stem. I had to junk one intake, one exhaust. Thankfully, these are really inexpensive for Rehab 5000 series valves. Not a big deal. If it was titanium, would be a problem. You know, these are over $150 a piece. That would be a bit of a tragedy. To replace these, it's about $12 a piece. So what needs to be done to fix that pair of heads? Well, I've got to replace the guides with a different style of valve guide. This is a perfectly good guide for a motorsports or racing only application. I'd like to see this in a situation where there's a lot of heat or a power adder only on the exhaust side. This was simply a case of using the wrong guide for the application. This was a street car. In my opinion, a full phosphor bronze guide does not belong in a street engine. What should go into a street engine is a nice quality manganese bronze guide. And again, there's different alloys of manganese bronze. There's some that have a high polonium content. Really don't recommend it. I personally only use valve guides that come from CHE or SI valves. There are plenty of other valve guide manufacturers, but those two I've had the best luck with, and I've got really good relationships with them. Now I've got a bunch of these guides sitting around. They happen to be just a little bit too long. You know, it's not really much of a big deal. All I'll have to do is get these put in the lathe and trimmed up. Here I've already done one. I'm gonna make them just a hair longer. I think it'll blend in with the ports just a little bit nicer. And in a street car, I think a little bit of support will go a long way. If I could install this guide and it wouldn't look so goofy with the extra length, I would. So let's go ahead and get these measured. Let's get these out of the way. Okay. Here's one of the original guides. Let me grab my calipers. All right, so that measures out at 2-inch 150 thousandths. The guides I have laying around measure out at 2-inch 400 thousandths. And then we're going to trim them down to the length of this guide, which I've already turned down. And this measures 2-inch 200 thousandths. So we'll have to trim off 200 thousandths off the bottom of this guide. I said I'd have to do it in a lathe, but for those of you that pay attention, I don't actually own a lathe. So we'll have to get these chucked up in my mill, and I'll show you exactly how I have to use my mill as a lathe sometimes. Lucky me. Now, just for a visual reference, this is what I'd like to see out of a good guide. You know, no visual wear. The original guides, I'd say it's about time they be replaced. Now quickly, before I forget again, these are the different types of guides that you'll often see inside of a performance engine. Here's our phosphor bronze guide. This is a manganese bronze. This would be a powdered metal or a cast iron guide. This specifically is a powdered metal guide. And then here we've got a guide liner. Now, phosphor bronze, again, I'd like to see that on the exhaust side of a big power adder deal, or if you've got some kind of exotic fuel. I'd also only like to see this in a race engine, especially one that's getting torn down often enough to where you can monitor guide wear. Manganese bronze, This is one of the most common types of valve guides you'll see in a street and performance application. They are a little more forgiving. That being said, issues with the guide would be a symptom of something else. If you stick one of these guides, it's probably because something else happened and it's not a fault of the guide itself. The next style guide you'll see used in performance applications as well as a lot of rebuilder applications is a guide liner. This is a K-Line brand, which is SBI now. I try to use a Rapid brand guide liner whenever possible. They're hardened, it's a lot better quality of a guide liner compared to the K-Line, but this is also a lot easier to get than a Rapid. This, if you notice the reddish color, is also phosphor bronze, but it's a different alloy. And they're also utilized in a totally different way. Instead of it being a full bronze, these get pushed into, say for example, a powdered metal guide or into a bronze guide. Then they get swedged into place, which means a ball gets pushed through here when it's installed in a guide, and that split pushes into itself. And that's how these guides get held into place. And the parent material will help support this guide liner and it'll help keep it from wearing. It actually ends up being a very strong valve guide, very rigid. And you'll see me use these quite often. The issues that you'll see commonly with a full phosphor bronze guide are not the same issues that you'd see with a K-liner. Oftentimes, issues that you see with a K-liner or a guide liner are going to be installation related and not at fault of the material itself. I've had these inside of the engines that have gone through their entire life cycle, taken the engine apart, found that the guide wear was very similar to what we'd see with a cast iron or a powdered metal guide. On an LS engine, for example, a lot of times the inside diameter of the guide isn't machined concentric to the outside of the guide. So when you go to replace it with a new guide where both those dimensions are machined concentric to each other, a lot of times you'll end up having to sink the valve job a mile. The guide liner resolves that because it follows the original hole and it also references off of the original valve job, and you'll be able to prevent yourself from having to sink the valve job a mile. These are also used in NASCAR and Top Fuel. It's very common in Superstock and other higher echelons of racing, and they happen to be very good in diesel applications as well. And lastly, this is the most common style valve guide that you'll see. This is a powdered metal guide. Similarly, you'll see the same style guide as in cast iron. I don't use cast iron. I don't think it belongs inside of modern engines. That you can buy them in a hardened form, and I think that's okay. But the type of clearances that you have to run with a cast iron guide don't lie in line with my own beliefs. So that's not something that you'll see me install inside of a pair of heads. Almost all modern engines are going to have a powdered metal guide. They're exactly what it sounds like. These come in from the factory as a powder. You can mix in whatever types of metals that you want to get your special mix, and they can add in all the wear characteristics that they'd like by increasing things like chromium or manganese and get similar wear characteristics as a bronze guide while having the longevity of a straight up cast iron guide. This is a great guide to use in OEM applications. And now the aftermarket is starting to pick up on the powdered metal, and you can install them as a replacement guide in most of these modern engines. Now, as far as machining difficulty, cast iron would be the easiest one to machine. Phosphor bronze is a close second. This stuff's really soft. It's also pretty gummy. Manganese bronze would be next. Bronze liner, I would say, would be tied with the manganese bronze. If it takes 15 minutes to install one of these guides, it takes an hour to install these guides. Then lastly, powdered metal is the most difficult of them all. That's why in a rebuilder application, you'll often see these ones being replaced with cast iron. That's a very common practice in the rebuilder world, and I really have some serious issues with that. This requires the same type of tooling as a bronze guide to machine. I suppose I can quickly go over that as well. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I saw one sitting inside of a box. There's some people that say knurling is an option. This is not. Knurling has been frowned upon since I'd say the 80s. Anybody that advocates for knurling as an option for servicing valve guides, as far as I'm concerned, is a hack. In today's world, the only place for a knurler, and this is a very specific situation, would be if you want to install a guide liner to bush a valve guide down. This specifically would be, say, installing an 11/32 guide liner inside of a 3/8 valve guide. These have a requirement for a guide bore dimension. When you go to push these in, you can't have a hole that's too oversized. If it's too oversized, this parting line won't push in on itself when you go to broach the guide in. That's where you can run into situations where your guide liner may fall out. If the guide wear isn't too excessive, you can run a knurler through. What that'll do is it'll displace the inside of the valve guide. Then you can go ahead and ream it for the press fit diameter required to install a guide liner. That being said, if the wear is too excessive, you need to bore that guide for another guide and then install your guide liner. Again, very specific situation where this may be used. As far as I'm concerned, knurlers are junk. Keep these away from your engine. Now, as far as machining cast iron, you only need some basic tools to machine them. You actually can't install a guide into a head and run it as is. The press fit affects the inside diameter. When you press a guide in, oftentimes it'll shrink. Half the time when you go to check the guide clearance on the bench without installing the guide, it's going to feel pretty good. And then once you install it in the head, it'll shrink enough to where you physically can install the valve. Most rebuilder shops have a set of high-speed steel reamers. I don't use these, mainly because I don't install cast iron guides. These aren't very rigid. You cannot use these to machine bronze guides. There are some companies that claim that they're high-speed steel reamers with their special geometry or special coatings can machine a bronze guide. But if it happens to get away with it, the inside of the guide won't be straight. Oftentimes, even if it does make it through, it'll end up snaking or end up turning into a U or even an S shape, and you'll be able to cut your valve job. Everything will seem fine, and then when you go to check your valve seat concentricity, you'll go and set your valve down into your seat, and it's going to stick on the valve seat, and you'll end up chasing your ass trying to figure out what's going on. Now, the only way that you can machine a bronze guide is to use a carbide reamer. Again, most shops don't have these. One, because they're cost prohibitive. You know, if a high-speed steel reamer costs $30, this costs $300. And another problem is you could end up owning 10 or 12 of these for different valve stem diameters or different applications. Another thing you'll run into if you try to use a high-speed steel reamer is if you go to try to bore the valve guide, a lot of times you'll get about halfway through, it'll lock up, you'll end up destroying the end of the reamer, and you'll end up having to pound this valve guide reamer out, and it just doesn't work. You end up destroying everything. It's a waste of time. Though carbide, it'll cut through this stuff like butter, leave a beautiful finish. You won't even need to do any honing. This is the most accepted method for machining a bronze guide these days. Another cost-related limitation with the carbide reamer and why you won't see these in a lot of shops. While you can use it to machine bronze guides in one pair of heads, you can't use that same reamer to then machine powdered metal guides in a different set of heads. Once it's used with bronze, it needs to be kept with bronze guides. And once you've used your carbide reamer to machine powdered metal, that reamer should only be used for powdered metal. You also cannot use these to machine cast iron. You'll probably get away with it a few times, but pretty quickly you'll wear out the cutting edge on that and you just destroyed a $300 reamer. Now, the nuclear option is to hone all of your guides. This is certainly the most versatile, but it's also the most time consuming. And there's also a cost aspect that comes into play with a guide hone. Again, you won't see these in a lot of machine shops. Most shops that haven't kept up with the times will only have high-speed steel. The shops that do invest into tooling will have these two products. Or you'll even see a counterpart to this, which is made by Sunnin. They use a vitrified abrasive. This is a Goodson guide hone, which uses a diamond abrasive. The Sunnin guide hone is a better piece. This is more modern, but this thing from Goodson is just pretty cheaply made. But it's not cheap to buy. I think the current pricing on this kit is about $2,800, if not $3,000. You can buy it and it comes with 3 or 4 different mandrels for different guide sizes. So to hone 11/32, you'd have to have one mandrel. Then to hone 8mm, you'd have to have a different mandrel, and so on and so forth. And each of those mandrels, I think these days are like $350, $400. It adds up, and again, it's time consuming. A well-tooled modern shop will have all 3, especially if they're doing rebuilder work. Anybody that's in the high performance realm will have carbide reamers and guide hones at their disposal. I do have some friends of mine that exclusively hone their guides. That's okay, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If they're willing to put in the time, more power to them. I'm not going to get into detail here, but there are also some exotic alloys like Amco 45. This is a manganese bronze type valve guide. Amco 45 has some very good wear characteristics. Kibblewhite sells a lot of guides with this material. They advertise it as, I think, a C6300. And now this isn't super common anymore. This is a valve seat, but sometimes you'll see guides that are made out of this. You'll see copper beryllium used in a valve guide as well. It's kind of frowned upon to use this stuff anymore. There are better alloys that won't kill you. Copper beryllium is very toxic. In a chip form, it's not really bad for you, but there are some special handling procedures required to work with it. In a dust form, it's known to cause nervous system breakdown. As an alternative to copper beryllium, you can get guides made out of Moldstar 90. This is also an exotic material. This is notoriously difficult to machine. It's very commonly used as a valve seat in LS7 applications, NASCAR, even some open wheel applications. You'll see Moldstar 90 being used. I've never machined one of these guides, but reportedly you can't use a carbide reamer. You're required to hone these. And I'm told that they're so hard that it'll actually wear out a valve stem. The end-all be-all valve guide apparently for an LS7 is Moldstar 90. While the guides that I use from CHE may be upwards of $14 or $15 a piece, a valve guide made out of Moldstar 90, last I heard, was closer to about $80 a piece. And a guide liner, I don't use K-Line brand inside of LS7s, I use Rapid brand. Those are about $2 a piece. As far as this channel is concerned, you'll only see these types of guides being used by me. You'll see me use manganese bronze, you'll see me use guide liners, and you'll see me use powdered metal guides. These are the most pocket friendly, they're long wearing, good thermal characteristics, and they're very easy to work with. Well, I've been busy rearranging things. I got a deal on one of these downdraft benches. I've been wanting one of these for a very long time. They're kind of hard to come by, and when they do come up for sale, they tend to be pretty expensive. I pretty much got this thing loaded up in the back of my truck within an hour of finding out it was up for sale. So lucky me. I retired the old porting bench, which was a hand-me-down from a friend of mine, to video duty. Put a little top on it, put it up on wheels. I actually got my vices and my grinders off of the ground. Pretty happy with this. It didn't occur to me that I could put a bench here, and as long as it was on wheels, everything would be okay. Lastly, I added an inexpensive sonic cleaner from Amazon into the mix. I figured between the sonic cleaner and my special solvent tank, I'd be able to clean all my heads a lot nicer. Which means I can do nicer videos for you guys. I need to build a storage shelf, maybe some hangers for my die grinders. I need to add in some new lights because the light that came with this downdraft bench is pretty useless. One more thing I plan on doing is getting the flow bench up on wheels. I need to get that moved to the clean side of the shop. Eventually, we'll do some videos with this thing. Getting into that thing is going to be a little bit of a rabbit hole. I really don't want to go down that path until I really feel ready for it. I've wasted weeks of my life on that machine, learning and unlearning what I thought I knew about porting. Before we put a pin in it, we're going to get those valve guides turned down. I've got some lathe tooling in my vise. I'm already set up. We're going to chuck up some valve guides inside the collet, and we'll be using the mill as a lathe. All the same principles apply here. Goes pretty quickly. I try not to do this very often, but sometimes I've got no choice. I'm not entirely sure I have enough room here to add a lathe into the setup, so it is what it is. Before anybody points this out, I'm highly aware I can buy guides that are the correct dimension. But I happen to have these. I think I'm going to modify what I have. I'll have to chamfer the ID. Clean up that burr when we put the chamfer into the guide. Hand filed a little radius into it. So work nicely. That was a lot of information to unload. I'd say we can call it quits right about here. Taking our guides, trimmed them down to length, I chamfered the ends. A nice little hand radius on the end. I got both heads prepped out, ready to get the old guides removed and new guides installed. I've taken our calipers and measured all of our overall lengths. Everything's exactly where I want it to be. I do want to take the time. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. In the past week, we've had almost 1,700 new subscribers. I love reading the comment sections, though they do get a little strange. I've had anywhere from legitimate questions to just love and general support to, a lot of infuriated boomers, maybe a little bit of confusion amongst the Gen Z crowd. I've even had a couple death threats. All of this is fine and dandy. I do enjoy every last bit of it. I will be disappointed if I don't hear any criticisms as to my measuring tools. We're going to keep the channel going. I'm starting to put more time and resources into the channel. It's going to get better. We'll be doing some cool stuff. I'm currently looking for a seed and guide machine. I do all of this in my own time. Really, if it wasn't so much fun for me, I wouldn't have the motivation to keep this going. So thanks for supporting the channel. I couldn't have done all of this without the help and guidance from Mitch at Jamsey Online. You guys have been very loyal every week. I'll do my best to keep fresh content coming. We'll get 1 or 2 shorts every week, and to get at least 1 long form video every week as well. This week it took me a little bit longer to get something out. I was recovering from the itis, but the hard part's over now. Even my own family's coming across the videos. They're really loving it. I had a beloved uncle of mine call me last week. He calls me up and he says,
Engine Rehab? What website's that? More like madeupmonkey.com.